All right, Daniel. I don't really know how else to start this one because we're probably going to go all over the place. I think maybe as a little bit of a framework, I I, I want to talk about art and maybe more specifically the artist and their role in society. I came across you through philosophical channels, and that was maybe 3 months ago or something like that, and then you just kept popping up in different places, and then I found the TLC, and you were there too, and so I don't know if there's anywhere you're not these days, but to frame the conversation, and then I'll let you kind of kick us off. I am wondering about art as a potential bridge between whatever it is that's crumbling in our society and whatever it is that is possibly in our future on the positive side, in a non-doomeristic sort of way, something that we could build that would be good. And I think the artist has always spanned that gap of the known and maybe the divine or something like that which is ideal and in the future. So I think I'll leave it there because I'm confident in your abilities to run with that. So what do you got?
Well, you're very kind, goodness, and thank you for having me, Ian. I appreciate the opportunity. No, art is a very big deal. OG Rose starts with creative writing, and so there's a few things. So first off, I'm of the strong opinion that many of our, say, intellectual contradictions or problems are a result of not starting with the right phenomenology. And what the word phenomenology means is kind of way of experience. But then also phenomenology is not merely experience. It's a question of, okay, if I experience color, then what must reality be like for me to experience colors? And what kind of being must I be to perceive color, right? So it always kind of, phenomenology has ontological implications, right? It would suggest something about what we are and how we are, right? And so for me, very often we've asked philosophical and theological questions from the standpoint of someone who experiences the world primarily in the mode of, say, an academic or a teacher or an engineer or someone whose experience of information is, I memorize it, then I recite it to the class, they give it back to me in the form of a test, and I grade it, right? So that's kind of the way you experience ideas, much more of a sort of memorize and trade and trivia and stuff like that. And of course, there's a place for all of that. But our way of experiencing thought has a tendency to then be essentialized into us saying that, well, that is thought. That is what thought is, and that's all it is, and that's kind of the role it has, right? And what that ends up doing is, to start, it tends to create a feeling that ideas are over here in the classroom where you learn them, and practice and working with the hands are over there, right? Because the main way you experience ideas is primarily in the context of the schoolroom, for example, or the classroom, or knowing the ideas that you need to have for the investment portfolio or stuff like that. There's kind of of course, I've never met anyone who believes in a hard split between practices and ideas, but what ends up happening is a certain emphasis or a certain kind of skepticism of the relationship between ideas and practice. And then you can also start to get, to look at kind of politics, almost a kind of anti-intellectualism, because it is seen as we're smarter than you, so we can tell you how to live your life and command economies and tyranny and all that other stuff. But then on the flip side, without ideas, you can easily be manipulated. You can be told what's the truth. You don't know any better, and then you get pulled along, right? Well, the artist is a really big deal because the phenomenology of the artist can actually start to show that in the experience of ideas, feeling like you're caught up in something that you're creating that's creating you at the same time, that you have an idea of what the characters are going to do, but then you also feel like you're watching them show you what you're going to do, right? Like you have an entirely different experience of how ideas fold and how the line between ideas and practice needs to be deconstructed. That is not so simple, right? Like, so the experience of the jazz artist. I know Viveki and James Wiggy will talk about this. When you're improvising music, you have this weird feeling of choosing what you're going to do freely, but also being determined by the rest of the group. So this kind of long-standing contradiction between free will and determinism starts to dissolve in the phenomenology of the artist, right? Likewise, in the phenomenology of the artist, many artists will talk about feeling like the muse gave them this, or God, or they were inspired by the Holy Spirit. And yet, in that very inspiration of the Holy Spirit, they also have a feeling, oddly, of being more free than ever before. Oh, wait a minute. Shouldn't you feel less free if you're being used by the muse, but actually you feel a certain fittedness? And you're like, this is and you're choosing the determination as it is choosing you. So you have this kind of co-creation that is occurring, right? So to start, art, especially the act of creating art, the action of creating art. Sometimes I think philosophers and theologians will emphasize the art product, like the novel, like the painting, which of course is actually very important. Someone like a Hans Gadamer suggests one of the reasons we don't understand history is because we don't review the paintings of history. And what he means by that is like you don't learn from history until you learn how people in these times experience their world. And he says that art gives you the horizon of experience, not merely information. It's one thing to learn when the American Revolution was. It's an entirely another thing to kind of apprehend the way they experienced and saw the world at the time, right? Like you'll get in the painting. And someone like Gadamer and then like maybe a Hayden White, they would say if you don't actually read the literature and art of historical moments, you're not going to get what was happening. You'll get the information, but you won't get the meaning. And if you don't get the meaning, you won't get the care. And if you don't get the care, you're not going to change your actions. Like, Hegel says the only thing we learn from history is that we don't learn from history, right? That's kind of that funny idea. Well, these guys would be like, well, of course, because you don't learn from you can't learn from history unless you fully absorb the lesson, and you can't do that without art, actually. You can't do that without absorbing the horizon of meaning. The word horizon in philosophy is like this very kind of way things come forth to you, like the way you experience things. And what I will note there is that art is extremely important because if you look at the art in, say, the 1850s, I'm just making up, examples here, so this is probably not technically correct, but there's more of an emphasis, say, on realism, for example, right? Well, the very fact that people in this period of time are emphasizing realism says something about how they subjectively experience the world. Like, it's not merely a random choice. It says something about the socioeconomic situation at the time. So, for example, if you don't have cameras, which of course is a little before that in the 17s or whatever, like if you don't have cameras, then yeah, you're going to try to be realistic. And the point of art is going to be to mimesis, accurate representation. But after the camera, then it's like, well, what's the point of art now, right? You may be looking to do something more abstract or looking cubism in all these different forms because you're trying to actually locate what is the role of art. But what's interesting then is that art, one, in that just change, says something about the technological situation. It says something about people feeling like there's something missing from a pure replication standpoint. Like there's another way of seeing or a deeper way of seeing that we're looking for that you're exploring for in art. And so in a way, art becomes the history of subjectivity. Like it becomes a kind of history of phenomenology and subjectivity, right? And learning that is going to be necessary to learn history. But also it suggests, here's the other key. And then I'll get back to what I was saying about the creative act, is that there's that idea that we make our tools and our tools make us, right? Like we make, the famous McLuhan, actually was the priest in McLuhan took it. But anyway, so likewise, we make our art and then art makes us, right? So as we create ways of perceiving or ways of seeing things, that literally kind of trains us on how to see the world, right? And then that trains us into the art and we go back and forth, right? And here's the thing, if there's something today about our very subjective experience of the world that's problematic, like our very inability to kind of perceive, I want to say stuff like the gestalt or the fullness of experience, then art plays a role as a training ground to help us learn how to have nutritious experiences, nutritious forms of experience, so that creates care and motivation. And then life, also art makes, like if everything around you can potentially inspire art, then everything you can suddenly care about, because all of it has a potential to be part of a creative act, right? So art can kind of train your ability to experience the things around you creatively while simultaneously transforming all the phenomenon from merely being facticity to creative material and possibility. And now you are actively in the life of the artist, experiencing what it's like to participate in reality. Like there's a lot of people in the TLC and in general talking about the need of participation. Reality is something we participate in. Well, it's one thing to say that. and say, yes, we participate in reality. And another thing to experience it and to quote unquote get it. And it be something that has emotional meaning to you. Like if I say we need to participate in reality, there's a threat that that's just information. You hear that, you agree. And because you agree intellectually, you think you do it. And actually, if you're not doing it, you wouldn't know you're not doing it because you haven't had the experience to know you're not doing it. So that becomes a problem. Art is how you get it in that Ziegler. You apprehend what it means to participate. And you get what it means that there isn't a subject-object divide,
The
right? A lot of people are
strike
saying
of
there's no
beauty.
the strike of beauty, and then you feel how the objects out there are participating with you in a creative unfolding, right? A lot of people saying the subject-object divide is a problem, right? That we're the subject and the object. One thing to say that, entirely something else to experience that. And the experience of art affords you that. And I guess what I'll just say, and then we can just the reason why then I'm emphasizing the creative act itself versus the creative products is because when you pay attention to yourself as you're creating, as you find yourself writing Esperanza, as you find yourself in a piano improvisation, and note how you as a subject are acting in the world and carrying it out, that experience, that mode of the subject is what we need to make central to philosophical and theological inquiry, which would then have economic ramifications, political ramifications, sociological ramifications. We have basically made the center of philosophy, and thus thought in general, right? Because philosophy is going to bleed over into all the other fields, which then has the problem is actually does affect the world. Like that's the issue. Like the game, you can't get out of idea. The game's on. Ideas matter. Like, it's just a question of what are we going to do about it? More has to be said. That's like Richard Weaver or whatever. But the idea is that like we have basically made the basis of thought either the removal of the subject, getting subjectivity out, or we have made it a subjectivity that is central, but in a sort of absent, like a stagnant way, not taking seriously the different conditionalities of the subject or what it can do, right? We need to make center a particular mode, a particular qualitative experience of the subject, and that for me is the phenomenology of the artist. And once you make that central, to get to your question, and then I'll stop, is that you start to see how it bridges the material and the spiritual. You see how it bridges God and creation. Like in that very mode of being, you see how these things actually can fold together. And so in that way, the artist, the phenomenology of the artist can start to quote unquote heal the divide between the secular and the religious, the theology and the philosophical, that it opens a clearing, a Heideggerian clearing for new thinking, and to see that it's not an either or, and actually these things can inform one another. So to me, the artist, the creative act, live in the middle of the creative act certainly becomes foundational.
There's a way in which artfulness, or I don't know what we would call that, the being in the zone is one way people put it. But existing as a vessel that is being poured into and pouring out, is sort of spiritually abstract. Like I'm reaching at religious language in my mind to try to comprehend that or to ground it, and I'm a little hesitant to do that just because I think a majority of people that listen to my podcast are probably like Christians in particular, not just spiritual. But then this applies much more broadly to humanity, and then you have the problem of like Christians say, well, yeah, the Bible applies to everybody, So right, sure, but I guess I'm curious about how to get that to a place where you can recognize the appropriateness of an artist existing in the world as an artist and say, see, there's the artist in their natural habitat doing exactly what they were designed to do, whether or not they philosophically acknowledge, that they were designed to do it. It's there's a strange disconnect there I'm sensing of your metaphysical assumptions will limit your ability to give credence to the thing that you see in the world that represents exactly what you would long for in your own life. So as a believer, you'd say, I just want to be doing God's will. That's precisely what you're detailing in the artist in the creative act. And even, just more archetypally, God is the creator. He creates Adam in his own image and says, like work this garden, and gives him something to create, some creative acts to do, and sends him on his way. But there's a connection to God, so that same through line is there in Adam's life, and then so in everyone else's. And when you dismiss maybe your own connection to the divine, I think it's hard to recognize it when you see even that connection in someone who doesn't explicitly label it the same way that you do. So it's the same as what you were saying before about how you think that participation is important to be a part of, like it's important to do, but if you don't do it, then you would never know if you weren't doing it in the first place.
No, and that basically is the central paradox that means something like like regularly thinking is necessary. Because there's one kind of question of why bother with philosophy? Is it practical? Does it matter, or different things? Well, in my opinion, if you understand that there's this what I call the enclosure problem, which is that at any moment you could be enclosed in something and then not know you're enclosed by definition, like it seals the exit. If you understand that is always something that you are at risk of because you were fallen, and the experience of enclosure is and here's the other problem, is the feeling of being right. Like when you're enclosed, you enclose yourself because you think you're right. It's like Kierkegaard says about the man is in despair. The man is in despair doesn't know they're in despair. Like that's the problem. But if you know you're in despair, you're on the way out, right? And that's why Christianity has this weird thing where it has to start with a death. Why? Because you don't know you're dead. Like it's not that you're already dead, actually, quote unquote. You're dying unto death, to use that language from Genesis. Dying unto death is this interesting phrase. But like you're already dying, and so you have to die to realize what was always already the case to change, right? So it's this weird thing of a realization that has to occur of mechanisms that are already underplay, right? Because it's like this idea when Christians talk about we're fallen. It's not like you have to know you're fallen to be fallen. It's the part of the fall is not realizing you're fallen, right? So there's this weird thing where Christianity simultaneously makes you aware that you're fallen and need Jesus at the same time. And like it is this weird double package that has to occur. But it makes sense that it has to have that character if the problem is this enclosure mechanism. This mechanism of if you're in a problem, you're also part of that very problem is that you don't see the problem. Like it conceals itself, right? Now, here's an issue though. That could create a whole lot of paranoia and a whole lot of nervousness and a whole lot of anxiety. And this is where we see various OCDs and pathologies develop in the church, because I'm afraid that sometimes the church, and I'll just speak of Christianity, but these things can happen in many religions in different forms. There's a certain sort of perhaps failure of recognizing the gravity of the message you're giving to people. Right? Like there's a failure to understand what you're actually saying to people, because you're also just thinking about basically the idea of we want to save them. So the key thing is that they're saved, right? So as long as we communicate they need to be saved, everything else is okay. The problem with that is if you're not paying attention, you may not be aware of the implications of the message you're giving to people. Like if you say something like, when sin has you not realize you're sinning, like you don't even know you're sinning. Well, what you're saying to people is that they're susceptible to paranoia. And even in telling them that, they could be paranoia and nervous and they don't know what to do. So this is what I'm getting at is this is a very hefty message that I would argue basically requires something like a philosophical culture to handle. And by that, I have in mind the ability to handle irony, complexity, kind of contradiction, and not be made mentally ill by it, right? Because there's another way that, for me, philosophy is necessary to avoid mental illness, and that would have to be expanded on. And also, the more complicated and globally connected the world is, and you lose what I call givens based on Philip Reeve, then the more likely it is to suffer mental illness. And so you actually need a practice to handle all of this information and bring it together into a whole, you can say, that then doesn't overwhelm you. Because if everything is fragmented, you can be pulled apart. But the idea is you need to kind of you need to actually be able to think through the implications and not be over. But I'll pause, please.
I've been thinking about the idea that there are two kinds of easy. It came up in a estuary conversation, and one kind would be like asking or telling your LLM to, produce an 11th grade level essay, and, you put the prompt in, receive your essay, copy, paste, you're on your way. And then the second kind of easy would be over many decades developing the skills necessary to discern what comprises an excellent essay, the ability to write over thousands of repetitions, and then sitting down with a topic and easily producing an excellent essay. And so these two different kinds of easy, I see in what you're describing there, that there's the easy answers of the enclosure, the rightness, and that appeals because it's the answer. It's right there. You just put it into the the Bible or whatever, and then you take out the answer and you live your life accordingly. But in reality, the necessity is for you to live, in relationship and harmony with God, such that as creation unfolds and your life unfolds and you meet various people in various situations, you're able to be on balance in all types of situations. And I think that there is not to confuse our language, but there's like an art of living, and I think that that's why I'm so focused on this, because I would say just from personal experience, like my mom, it's not my own experience, but she's talked about hating art class. But she loves beautiful things and words and pictures and all of these things. But I think that the structure was very enclosurist in the public school system that she operated in, and she likes to be an A student and succeed, and that makes sense. Like who wouldn't want to succeed at the game that you're being told to play? But when the game is sort of the first kind of easy, then you introduce this other thing that demands the second kind of ease, and you're in a situation where, well, yeah, I hate art because I don't have immediate success at it or immediate ability to produce exactly what I'm looking for. And I think personally, I've had that experience with like drawing and painting. And yet I still the creativity is like deep in my bones. So I just it seeps out in other ways because, whatever, I've disciplined myself in different ways. And all that to say that creating space for people to understand the need for discipline and growth in that way, education being the drawing out of what is potential within you rather than the, crushing down into the cog that society needs you to be. I think that's the direction that I'm headed with my thought on art.
I think that's a very big deal. So a few things. So on those two types of easy, like there's the easy of not doing it, and then there's the easy on the other side of discipline where it becomes a way of life, right? Now, again, I think in the phenomenology of the artist, you can actually learn those differences, right? Like the real difficulty of learning a craft and putting your head, but then after you do it, you get to the other side where it has this kind of ease to it because you learn the artfulness of it, this kind of like you were saying, this art of living, which actually is a wonderful phrase because that brings me to my beloved Ivan Illich. And so a few things. So you mentioned the garden, and you mentioned, so it's very interesting in the garden, image of God and the creative act and the metaphysics and so on, is that there actually is work in the garden, right? They have to name the animals, they have to take care of the garden, right? But there isn't toil. This is the key. That actually paradise entails work, which is very interesting. And actually leisure entails work. Leisure is not the absence of work, that Piper term, and that needs to be aligned, as Dr. Nieberhauser emphasizes, with kairos time. And kairos, as he was recently talking about, obviously you can think of the opportune moment, but that's kind of a mistranslation. It's the fullness of time that has this piercing element. The word kairos that Nieberhauser was saying is like a spear stabs you to the life source. So the life source comes out. So there's a work that you can do that releases the life source, you can say, right? And that this release of the life force, I think we can associate with the flow state, right? We can associate with this sort of like you're just in the flow. Now, critically, there are times where the flow states can be used to do evil things, right? I can be in the flow state as I kill people on the battlefield or something, right? So it's one of the tricky things with thought is that there are no innately good things. Art can be used for evil. Creativity can be used for evil, right? It's always, since we're talking about a geometry, to use a loaded phrase, since we're talking about an entire situation, it's about all of the things fitted together in the right way, in the right order, right? Like there is no one thing that you can do that is always going to be good no matter how you use it. Because if that was the case, then there would be no need for the personal knowledge, just the mechanic, just the artificial intelligence. We just need the moral thing to do would be to find that innately good thing and just always do it all the time, right? Thus reducing creativity and becoming basically a mechanic, like a mechanistic structure is what it would be, right? So part of being human is actually figuring out the right way that all things go together in the right time, in the right way that we're life discerning. Well, that's all a creative act, actually. So also it should be noted, when I'm emphasizing the phenomenology of the artist, I am not saying that it is exclusively in these activities like writing a short story that one can apply a particular metaphysical conception that we need to focus on. Really, the suggestion is, if in art, it is possible to have this experience where the subject-object divide goes away, fullness of time, you self-forgetful yourself. If it's possible while doing a short story, why wouldn't it be possible while doing the laundry? Why wouldn't it be possible in all areas of life? The phenomenology of the artist becomes a revelation of a possible mode of experience that would give us reason to believe can occur perhaps anywhere. Why couldn't it, right? Is there some sort of meta law that says it could not happen? It just tends to be the case that, to say something large, it seems as if it takes more time and effort, I suppose, to learn how to have the creative act while doing something you find boring, like maybe David Foster Wallace at the IRS, or to do the laundry, or when you're faced with your enemy. That seems to be more advanced and difficult. Whereas, say, writing the poem seems to be where it can kind of start, tends to be the initial place. Not that I'm saying it's easy, but it can be the place that you're most likely to have this experience, which if you never have that experience, you would never begin the ladder to climb to be able to do it with your enemy, right? Like you have that initial experience that opens up a horizon of possibility.
I just want to interrupt and say, I wonder about the role of play here, like, because you're playing with an idea, you're playing with words, writing a poem, you're playing with, whatever the medium is for your art. And in those other things, there's a sort of like seriousness or task orientedness that's like demanding other more rational faculties of us. And so the mode switches, because I was just thinking there's always this, like, when bad things happen, you're supposed to, well, one day you'll know why it happened. Like, yeah, but that doesn't help. Like what you just said, I can understand it, but it doesn't strike me. It's not the Kairos spear to, oh yeah, now I know. That happens later. That happens in a moment of revelation. And so I was thinking of, I'm reading Piper's Leisure, The Basis of Culture right now. So I only have till chapter 2. So everything after that, no spoilers. But there's this, like, he lays out the ratio and intellectus opposition, of which the medieval thinkers and ancient thinkers were familiar with that. But we've sort of shifted more towards the ratio, which he describes as sort of like, well, obviously it's the root of rational. It's this analytical. You're sort of quantifying things. You're looking for the facts, and intellectus is more receptive, and so you're actually just like taking in things, looking in at how things are, and so to oppose those two things, I would say very often we're operating in that ratio space. This is Ian McGilchrist. I think the reason he's so powerfully like attractive and he captures people like me. I always reference him, even though I'm only halfway through The Master and His Emissary. It's like the idea is so tied to this root of ratio versus intellectus, where we're trying to define things with the ratio. So you define things. So I'm thinking of the laundry. I'm trying to artfully do the laundry, or in a way that's connected to the way of being, the structure of being. Oh, clothes, I wear clothes. That's nice. I have enough stuff that I'm not destitute. That's nice. I'm folding my kids' clothes. I have kids. That's nice. But that listing is very like, it's an attempt to rationalize this process of being struck or having the Kairos spear, connect you to all of being. And the alternative is, if you are open in that moment, and rather than descriptive or definitive, if you're open, then you can receive in that moment a revelation from something beyond. This is the muse, from Pressfield's The War of Art, like, and just what you were describing, most people go through.
Everything you're saying is very important. There is something about play that is central to all of this. You even have books like Dan Brown on play that actually wants to argue like evolution, biological development selects for play. Like play is a mechanism of selection and stuff like that. So we've really overlooked.
Is this the Da Vinci Code guy?
No, it's a different same name, Brown, but yeah, it sounds like
Yeah.
it, right? But just really talking about how we've ignored play as a mechanism of exploring fittedness in the environment, and and so play is a really big deal.
Yeah, I come by play through Peterson, basically. Like, I haven't read Jaak Panksepp. I read a few papers by him, but none of his books. But it is interesting how biological it is. Like it's not just conceptual. It's not just like we can just philosophize our way away from it. It is something deeply necessary, not just habituated. You know what I'm saying?
And there's something also about play that's tied to experimentation and safety, and you're actually giving a space to explore how your body works, what you can do. It creates community. It has this really full structure, right? There is absolutely something about play that is also a kind of work, and it has a kind of, it has a certain new creation to it, right? Like, if new creation doesn't entail a kind of mode of play, how can it be joy? It's interesting how it's easy to say that heaven entails joy, new creation entails joy, but why not the word play? Because because that's not serious and it wouldn't be reverential, and you've got this you've got this false dichotomy where play isn't worship and worship isn't play. There really is a sense that play equals worship, right? Like, and it's interesting how we don't put those together in our brain.
The idea of worship sort of coming from worthship etymologically, it's like identifying the thing that is the most valuable. And so it's this exact same process of like an iterative game. I think iterations often come in the form of like business models or products, or that's the way our brains think of it. But like, you're trying different moves, like you play jujitsu, that's something that you play, or music. It's the same way, trying to play different patterns and figure out how to harmonize or improvise or all of these different things, even just to recite, like that's how you start, is reciting like the greats, or even just Mary Had a Little Lamb, whatever it is, because you're trying to get at your growth edge. Like, you're trying to discover the new and the possible.
Yep, 100%. Well, there's always this idea that the most important thing has to be treated as an end, not a means, right? Like, if you treat something as a means, you're dehumanizing it and so on. How else can you relate to an end and treat it as an end other than a mode of play? Like, play is when you don't treat a thing as a means. Play is when it's the end in of itself, right? You're fully invested in it. So the only way,
or when they snap together, is that possibly?
Yeah, absolutely. That's the end. Oh, they snapped, and then you enjoy the thing that snapped together. If you go, oh, snap together, moving on, then you're treating it as a means to the end, right? You have to go, yay, and actually enjoy that. Like, the only way, and I think, like, again, there are many ethical theories about the good, right? And basically all of them agree you shouldn't treat people as a means to an end, right? Then what do I treat them as? Like, how should I treat them, right? Since philosophers tend to be serious, and they tend to have a certain sort of serious bias, for good and for bad, they can't answer that question so well. It ultimately has a thing that you treat as an end and not a means is going to have a few qualities. It's going to have to be beautiful, meaning you want to worship it and observe it and not use it as a tool. It's going to have to be inspiring, because instead of using it, it inspires you to act, to kind of head out. It's going to generate action in its presence, not of it, right? Like, it's going to generate sort of life in its presence, not using it to do something, right? And all of these are the characteristics of play, right? So the only, like, there's an argument to be made that the only things we ever treat as an end versus a means are that which we play with. And because we enjoy it for its own sake. We're not trying to get anywhere, right? We're not trying to go beyond it. We're having a good time, right? Now, funny enough, in a game, there can be competition, there can be conflict, there can be winners and losers in different things, but the game itself is an end to afford that horizon of interaction and possibilities, right? Like, you're not trying to get beyond the game, you're trying to dwell in the game as an end of itself that sets the board of possibility for your world, right? And so it's not something you're trying to get beyond, and yet nevertheless can entail hierarchies and skill and embetterment and whatever, right? But it becomes a kind of given field of interaction, if you will, right? And then, of course, that's in many respects conflating play and game, but there's a way in which God is not a game, but there's a playful spirit that God inspires, right? So either the end has to have a kind of game structure, or it has to inspire a playful mode of being that you bring into any game, anything you go into. And this is, like, this gets a bit into the car, finite and infinite game, but please.
I've been thinking about infinite games, finite games. I just saw another Naval Ravikant quote about play long-term games, not short-term games. And I thought that was an interesting adaptation of this infinite and finite thing, because I was noticing that institutions tend to play finite games, but they sort of implicitly state that they're supposed to play these finite games infinitely. It's a strange thing. So a business that will one day be irrelevant because it will just go away. Like, that's, nobody is here for the aqueduct construction company that the Romans had, because we just do it a different way. It's totally irrelevant. And so, but at the time they would have been like, yes, this is very important. We're doing super important stuff, and we will always do this stuff. And so we just hired a new president. Oh yes, and the institution continues. And the same goes for any educational systems. All these things, they just they're truly finite, right? Like that's obviously what an institution is a finite thing. So the attempt to make something finite produce something infinite is, I guess I'm wrestling with that. So I don't know where you can take us.
Well, that leads to many forms of pathology. So there's a few things. What can be useful here is Hegel makes a distinction between a spurious infinity and a true infinity. And he argues that most of the time we're stuck in spurious infinities. And what that is a list. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, you can go on forever. That's a spurious infinity. To say something very large, anything that tries to be a spurious infinity is going to be, entropy will take over. It will die, and then it will deny that it's dying, it will become pathological, and it will kill anyone that tries to keep it, put it down. And that's, you could argue that happens to people, nation states, businesses. They become spurious infinities, and it's very, very bad, right? But Hegel also talks about a true infinity. And what a true infinity is a circle. Like, a circle is interesting because it goes in a circle and it touches the other side, and that actually could be a true infinity. But funny enough, you can see it. Like, it's finite observable, and yet it's a true infinity, whereas a infinite list goes on forever.
Yeah. I've been researching this a little bit. So I got into the Mandelbrot set, which has, and I guess this is true of most fractals, but like it has a finite area, but the border, the perimeter is infinite.
Yep.
And that's fascinating, because I guess the difference would be, so you're saying the listing is just all the numbers, and then I'm not good at math, but the Mandelbrot set is all of these numbers through an iterative formula within, like, bounded by the number 2. Yep. And so that's what creates the pattern, is the constraint. Yep.
That's exactly right. And that's a true infinity. And arguably, to say something very large, when people talk about sacramental ontology, kind of creation, it's a true infinity. Because the suggestion is that every time you look at a phenomenon, like a flower, actually, there's a certain infinity that is actually contained in that bounded phenomenon. And so every phenomenon,
the kairos and the strike of beauty.
Yes, that's right. And so that strike of beauty is possible in every phenomenon, because every a phenomenon is a bounded infinity, like a true infinity, right? And the problem, but here's the problem: the brain, as the frenemy, naturally goes in the direction of spurious infinities, not true infinities. Right? Like, it naturally goes in the direction of listing, because, to say something very large, the binding is the death. The binding, you have to accept your limit to be infinite. That's the weird move, is that you have to die to yourself to live. So the brain does not, and I know all of this has to be explained on it. The brain does not naturally understand contradiction. Like the brain, and this is where we talk about the map is the territory stuff. The brain thinks the point of thinking is to remove contradiction naturally. That's the natural tendency, right? I'm not saying that has to be what it does, but that's what it will do if you don't actively fight it. Like if you don't actively make it realize that no, contradiction is necessary for thinking, and then you get into like paraconsistency. Anyway, the point is the brain can't make sense naturally of the idea that a limited infinity is infinite, right? So it's going to naturally go in the direction of a spurious infinity. Like the brain will naturally understand infinity means the number keeps going up. The GDP keeps going up forever. It continues to grow, right? That makes sense. That makes total sense, right? And that's naturally also how I experience infinity as x plus 1. That's how I experience it, right? And when I think, here's the key. When I think about it, I naturally think infinity equals x plus 1. But here's the issue. Thinking, now this is kind of phenomenology weirdness. Thinking naturally translates perception into syllogism and thought, like words and stuff, right? Like I'm not saying there aren't image thinkers, but when I think about infinity, I don't naturally remember the experience of the strike of beauty in a rose, right? I think I'm more naturally going to think of a formula, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. One of the reasons is because it is very hard to remember emotion. Like when you fully fell in love, for example, you can remember falling in love, but to recall and bring back the same intensity of emotion is very, very difficult. And like people can't on will recall the mystical experience. They can know they had it. They can remember that that was a emotionally intense experience, but it's very difficult to bring back the emotion itself. Do you understand what I'm saying? So one of the reasons art is important is actually to kind of train you to get better at that and to remind you of these emotional depths. But the reason I'm saying all this is because true infinity is more of an emotional apprehension, a sort of experience of the rose in a way where you get the strike of beauty. And that's not natural for the brain to remember or to think of when it thinks about infinity. So then it goes in the direction of the spurious infinity and it says, that's what I want because I don't want to die. And that seems like the goal. So then I make my corporations to make the number go up forever. Not to create conditions of experiencing true infinity. I don't create spaces of the strike of beauty. I create business plans to make sure we never go out of business. More can be said, but I'll pause.
Yeah, so this is all extremely relational. This is I'm thinking of just what you were saying. It's difficult to remember emotions. And so to put back together the members of the moment that were comprising that situation that evoked those emotions. But here's the thing. Like it's inherently relational. So you can't remember because the other person and even maybe who you were at the time are gone.
That's it.
Those it's almost like what you're saying about the bounded infinity or the finite. How did you say it? The non-spurious one.
Oh, the true infinity. Hegel's true infinity.
The true infinity.
Yep.
It requires those constraints, and it's the death that leads to infinite life. To go in the religious poetic language, it's like it requires relationship because in order to experience those things. And so you can never re-experience them because that's not how it works. You can repeat processes in order to do x plus 1 sort of functions in all sorts of ways. But yeah, I mean, even people like I'm thinking of, I don't know why, but I'm thinking of like the dopamine problem. If you go on YouTube, you see every video is like how to fix your dopamine. And it's because our phones and we're just extremely addictive in our culture. But so pick any number of things that you could be addicted to. You have diminishing returns because your relationship is a spurious infinity.
That's it.
It's just x plus 1. And then it needs to inherently sort of, you need to up the dose. So it's x plus 10, x plus 100. And then I feel like that's the non-relational version of infinity. And so it's very strange because x plus 1 feels rationally obvious, obvious things being the most dangerous things. And then 1 is truly infinity, right? So just x and plus, get those out of here. Let's focus on 1. And that is that I'm sorry to do this, but I've got a half-baked thought that I've
Please.
been trying to write out about the fractal nature of reality. So humanity descending from their creator God is the image that I'm working with, and then being built back up into one in Christ, right? That's the image of the church, is that we all come together in one as the Father and the Son are one. We participate in the oneness. And so we're like 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1, and we keep wanting to add, but rather it is the original oneness that we're called back into with our individuality. So this is the strange part. That's more, we can maybe broach that subject in a few minutes, but like you were talking about the Gestalt, and I do want to talk about that. So any thoughts at this point?
No, everything you're getting at is exactly on it. So there's a few things. So first on, let's take a company. How can a company say, hey guys, you know what we're going to do? We're going to intentionally make less money or not strive to make more. It can't do it, right? So I'm going to say a bunch of things at each one of these points.
Well, hold on. I'm sorry, not to throw your example off, but like I would just want to say, like, nobody needs to go in the wrong direction, right? We're not advocating doing dumb things.
Correct.
It's like if you say relationality is, that's ontological reality. Like you need to be in relationship, and that means people are very important. And so we're going to prioritize people. Yes. Well, you can't have both goals.
Correct.
Right? A company can't say we prioritize our people. They do say it all the time, but and then say that the bottom line is actually what you prioritize through your actions.
Right. So no, but that's the key point, is that the very logic, so a few things that every one of these points could use elaboration, but I'll say them. So the first thing I'm claiming is that the frenemy brain is naturally toward a spurious infinity, not a true infinity. And a key reason for this is we can't remember the constraints. Like you can recall falling in love and feel nice about it, but that feeling of nice is not the same emotion you had literally in the falling of love. And that's where we can get confused. Like you require that the constraint of that one-of-one situation to create the emotional effect and the fullness of the experience. And once it's gone, it's gone. And actually the fact that it can only be lived is precisely why it's so wonderful, right? Like it has this fundamental presence to it, and evanescence and life to it, and that itself
participation.
Participation, and that itself is the very character of a creative act, right? And there's more reasons, but the claim I'm making is that the brain is toward the spurious instead of the true infinity. And it takes work to get to the true infinity, and that will bring us back to the games and the metaphysics question you posed on the conflict with the artist. But the other issue is that the nature of group incentives, institutional incentives, here's the point. We all have to choose an infinity. Like, it's not possible to not choose an infinite structure. And what I mean by that is if you have a business, you have to go in the direction of either x plus 1 or the circle. You have no choice, because you can't say we're going to do x minus 1. No, you can't will the bad. You have to will the good, right?
And you'll get to zero.
And you'll get to zero, and you'll die. It's suicidal. But here's the problem. X plus 1 doesn't have a limit. So where does the limit come from? And it's not given here's the issue. It's not given by the structure of a spurious infinity. So here's the key. You find yourself pulled along, like you're pulled. And this, how today people are talking, like even someone like Tim Dillon saying, it feels like something is coming. Like we're barreling towards something and we can't stop ourselves, right? Like we're just, there's that idea of the Klee angel of history, where you have this angel on a wire and it's just kind of pulled along, right? Like a bird in Faulkner on a wire, it's just pulled along. Or Kafka. I think Kafka novels are all about characters who are pulled along and they can't stop themselves. And you see, like, what ends up happening is the characteristic of a spurious infinity is this feeling of we can't stop it. Like, we've got to make the super AI, or China's going to do it. It's a multipolar trap, game theory stuff. It's all these feelings of you can't stop it. That is the characteristic of a spurious infinity, this inability to stop the direction you're going in, right? But here's the issue. The only way to stop, you can't intentionally stop, because that would mean you're not willing the good. Like, the problem is all of these things are willing the good, right? They're willing to do something good. The problem is that good intentions can be the road to hell, right? But does that mean you need bad intentions? There's no such thing as bad intentions. So you're stuck being pulled along. The only hope you have is to add a limit. And the limit, because then you're going to hit the limit, right? And that's going to stop it, right? But how do you choose a limit? Because if you choose a limit, then it's not really a limit because you had the power to will it, right? So you have to somehow impose a limit that is part of the environment itself of being human that naturally results in the spurious infinity having to add dimensionality and becoming the one, like a geometry, right? But then, of course, and I know this is all large and blah, 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 but the question is, how do we turn things into that one of one, right? Because the way you move from a spurious infinity, x plus 1, to a true infinity, the one, is where you actually create a constraint, and in that constraint create a fractal and create a depth, right? So this is how I would describe that. So the example I'll make sometimes, kind of based on Dante, is we naturally, you have a generality, I'll say, and I'll base it on Beatrice, because that's what Dante does. You have a generality that is women, then you have a particularity that is a woman, and then you have the definitive that is Michelle, right? Like it becomes a definitive woman as Michelle. And here's the interesting move. As you move from the general to the particular to the definitive, you have full knowledge. I know what women are. Full knowledge. I know what a woman is. But a definitive, you can't know other than in relationship, right? So as you move from the general to the definitive, you actually get more of a one of oneness, where the only way to know who Michelle is an active relationship all the time. That means you have to be committed to Michelle. You have to stay bounded in the relationship to Michelle. And then women become Michelle, right? So here's my claim. The brain naturally tends to be toward generalities, like women, maybe a particularity, like a woman or this company. The brain struggles with definitiveness because definitiveness is an unknown, right? I don't know everything. And the brain doesn't like not to know everything. Also, I have to admit that I'm not in control because I can only know the fullness of Michelle in relationship to the degree she opens up to me, right? So I don't control everything, right? But here's the funny thing. Deepest reality is in the definitive. It's in the Michelle, not in the women, not in a woman. It's in the definitive, right? So this is the point. If we stay intellectually in the general or the particular, we always get a spurious infinity because it's always a plus one, plus one, plus one. Or it's a meaningless general category, like humanity. What is that? That's just kind of an empty set, right? So you either get an empty set that you project into, and it's like a Dostoevsky novel where you love humanity but can't love individuals anymore, like Zosima says, or you get, a person and then another person, comma, spurious infinity, and that becomes meaningless. In order to get the fullness of the person, they have to become definitive, which means they become Michelle. So the only way to get the fullness of what things are is to bind yourself. Because you transform a person into Michelle by commitment. Like, that's the only way you do it. You bind yourself. And then in that very binding, you find that you actually know less. That's the weird thing. You know more when you know a generality. Like, you have, more knowledge than when you know Michelle. Because there's an infinite depth to them. That knowledge transforms, right? So what you're doing, so here's the issue. To move from the spurious infinity to the true infinity, you have to bind yourself. But that also means you have to be the subject that can actually, love and be kind and be patient and enable someone to open up. So here's the issue. The only way, this is the point, the only way to stop a spurious infinity from going on forever and ultimately becoming cancerous, because a cancer cell refuses to die, right? Alex Ebert makes this point. So spurious infinities become cancerous. And the world is full of, as Jordan Hall and different people say, the game A dynamics. The game A dynamics versus game B dynamics are game A, and that means many things to many people, but just the language here. The game A is basically the problem of spurious infinities. And game B, quote unquote, and I think this effort of a new address, are the hope of a true infinity. The way you change a spurious infinity to a true infinity is a constraint, because that opens up the definitive infinity. The constraint, though, is added by you being able to handle limitation as a subject. So it's fundamentally a character matter. It's fundamentally a virtue matter. You can't have a business plan that does it. You can't have a mechanical operation that does it. You can't have a worldview that does it. You can't have a map that does it. Like the whole point of the quote unquote book, like a lot of the map is indestructible, is to say that maps are internally consistent systems that can only be themselves ultimately because of a girdle point. And if there's a girdle point, that means there's fundamentally a human element that can never be removed. But we can deny, but our very maps allow us to ignore it, basically, to deny it, or we accept it, and that actually opens us up to fuller logic and fuller thought. All of that has to be gotten into, right? So there's an opening there. But it comes down to character. I'll stop there.
So many things do come down to character. You were just making me think of like Lord of the Rings. I'm thinking of his maps in the the front of the book, and you've got like normal, all nice, and then like a smoking black mountain of death. It's like that's the girdle point. We got to take the ring of power there.
Yeah.
So I was running just quickly with your. It's a matter of character. It's a matter of virtue. I was going to virtues mentally as you were talking. Before you got there, I was thinking like, well, I wanted to talk to you today about like the good, the true, and the beautiful, because I think these things are so, they're the eternal virtues, and they are maybe difficult to engage with because of the dualistic understanding of the world that we have. Maybe dualism even is that X+1 sort of, it maps onto that at least. And I think that, when it comes to virtues are all well and good, but if they're abstracted from the person, the person with the character or the virtuous individual, then there is no relevance to them. Oh, that's so beautiful. It's almost the way that some Christians will look at Christ as like the ideal in some way, but there is no, you can't attain it in any way that's relevant. And so then you have people that are angry Christians, like, I don't understand. Like, I guess there's a way to be angry and not sin, but that's not what I'm referring to. Bitter or gossipy. Like, these are the words that people would use to describe these people who are following the way that Christ gave us to live our lives, maybe this art of living sort of thing. And anyway, so I was just thinking of other examples for that would be like, I can't remember the guy's name, but there's many people like him will write books about how to be, a great leader, or how to be a good business owner, or how to lose a lot of weight, or how, all of these like how-to books, they have that, they have the virtues sort of laid out in a way that's separate from the subject, the person that must they must live out the virtues, and they must bring to it their own virtuousness that makes these things work. So people will say, oh my gosh, this guy, he helped me so much. And that might be true, but the only reason that ever occurs is because you put into practice the virtue that is being detailed or indicated by someone who's gone before you.
This is very important. So I'm good friends with Thomas Jockin. He does a lot of work on Aristotle, and we constantly talk about the relations between beauty, health, friendship, how we have separated virtue from health. We've separated ethics and morality from health. And the great problem is we now associate virtue with being good as opposed to experiencing the beautiful. We also don't know what beauty is. We think it's symmetry when really it's the kairos. It's this breaking through of the fullness of time. And virtue is actually tied to the ability to experience beauty around you. And beauty is also tied to, we'll talk about lack, and is tied to constraint. For this point, I'll actually bring back up what we were talking about with play and why there is a kind of movement that occurs. So when you play a game, and I'll say this, and I'm going to say this is a lower level, but I don't mean it like in a hierarchy necessarily, because it's all necessary training, okay? So when you play soccer, you step into a field of rules, right? And the rules make the game possible. If there are no rules, there's no game. And when you walk onto the soccer field, you agree to the constraints, right? And everyone in the soccer field agrees to the constraint, if you will, right? So there's a constraint around you that makes possible the game, right? And that's why you can have fun. That's where the play can occur, because of the constraint, right? So the game is a sort of revelation of a certain space that is created once there's a constraint. Because here's the key. A constraint is not merely, a constraint also keeps out. It doesn't just keep you in, it keeps out, right? So alternative logics, alternative ideas of what the soccer ball should be used for, they're all out. They're not allowed to come in, right? And that's what creates an ability to kind of, the other is intelligible to you, even if you've never met them. Like you have a sense of what to do. It can even create a feeling of belonging, which is a big idea. So the game creates that. Now here's the issue. So there's some sort of relationship between play and constraint is ultimately what we're pointing to, that there is something about constraint and play that goes together. And that would also suggest that a spurious infinity is precisely where play will not occur. Because there's no constraint. Actually, spurious infinities are where burnout occurs. And, there's, Han is a very popular thing, burnout, society, and different things. Basically, you could say the modern world is defined by burnout, right? A lack of time, energy, people don't have Sabbath. Yeah, because the modern world is defined by the opening of Pandora's box of spurious infinities. There are spurious infinities everywhere, right? And we can't constrain them, and therefore we can't have play. What we have is numbness. We can have moments of numbing ourselves to the burnout via drinking or entertainment or whatever. And dopamine, right? Because dopamine is the spurious infinity that tries to make us numb to the spurious of all the other spurious infinities, right? But it's not actually a solution or an address because it has the same logical form. Like the problem is the form, if you will, right? And I kind of do mean that in a Platonic sense. The problem is the form. The form is x plus 1, which we're using as a stand-in for spurious infinity. So the dopamine thing can't be the address because it has the same form as the problem, right? And actually the reason why it's so problem is because it seems like it deals with the problem, but actually it does. It's a false revolution, if you will. It's a revolution that's actually two sides of the same coin, right? It's like the movie Snowpiercer or something, right? You think that you're revolting, but that's actually the mechanism of control, right? So really the name of the game is getting out of the spurious infinity, but by definition that requires a constraint, which and the constraint affords play. Likewise, the constraint, do not eat from this tree, makes it possible to have work, not toil, right? Don't do these sins, it makes it possible to have play. But here's the issue. As you leave the soccer field, how do you have constraints now? As you go do the laundry, where do the constraints come from, right? Because there's no game, and the constraints you have, the people around you may not have, right? If you never play the game, you don't see the relationship between play and constraint, of which then means as you go off into the world, you wouldn't perhaps think that you need constraints, right? It may not even occur to you that constraints have this positive possibility, especially if the entire social order is basically saying that the less constrained you are, the better. The more you realize yourself when you're not constrained, that you're just being held back. This is the language of the therapeutic, as Philip Reef said. Like the fullness of the person is when they're free from constraint, right? He said that was going to bring back totalitarianism because when people aren't constrained, they're overwhelmed by anxiety and they turn to a strong man, and he was correct. And all the sociologists were warning about that. But, anyway. So you need constraint. But here's the issue. How do you get constraint? How do you get it? Right? So I'll say one more thing, give it back to you before I keep going, is that virtue is tied to the ability to see and observe constraint that is not given by rules, but instead given by reality. Like what ends up happening in virtue is you actually come to experience reality as a place where there are things you do or don't do in order to be fully human. And you learn to discern them. Here's why there's a kind of advancement. There's a developmental logic to this. So you play the game, and I would argue that the creative act is kind of another step on this ladder because you feel the relationship between constraint and freedom and discerning what you can or cannot do in the art, right? So likewise, when you go out to work or you go out to do your laundry, the claim of Aristotle is basically that to the degree you are virtuous is to the degree you will have the capacity to discern the constraints that are part of reality itself that you must be able to discern in order to turn it into a true infinity and thus play. Like if you're not able to discern the very limitations in reality themselves, then you can't get play in this kind of fuller leisure sense, right? And that then is the only way to get a true infinity, a truly infinite game versus a spuriously infinite game, right? Because that's kind of the issue with Kant. There's actually, you could argue with Hegel, there would be two infinite games in this sense, right? There's the true infinite game, and then there's the spurious infinite game. And most people, basically without virtue, you're going to end up, if you're not in a finite game, you're going to end up in a spurious game, right? Like a spurious game. And so virtue is tied to this question. But I'll pause there, but there's a lot more to say.
So I'm thinking about the artist and their subjectivity, and the way that constraint is necessary in order to produce art. Jordan Peterson always used the example of like MIT students being asked to write a poem about spam or something like that, and it's like so like you write, maybe it was like a haiku or something, right? Something that's got a small sort of structural form, and you can sort of write those out over a period of time. But if it's just a haiku about anything, then it becomes very difficult to sort of pick your subject or your object to write about, and even to find within yourself, like, well, what am I going to pick? Is it going to be weird? Like the intimacy of revealing yourself with no constraint is difficult there as well.
Yes.
But then when you go to spam, then it gives you a very limited, bounded set. Like there's not that much about spam that you could get into, right? But it's actually the opposite. Like when you have one thing to focus on and dive deeper and deeper into, then it produces in you, like you rise to that occasion, and so you draw out of yourself all of these different ways of perceiving spam. And it's almost like Vervaeke will talk about combinatorial explosiveness, and so this is a fascinating paradox of like if you think about something truly and not in the way that's necessary for your brain to be able to perceive it just as an object, like a pen. That's always the example. This marker, and then it's like a cylinder, and it's two parts because I've got the cap, like all of these different things that you can break it down into. But also at the same time, that's where you can interact with it creatively. So I wonder about that in relation to what we were talking before about the way that we don't like the true infinity because it's truly infinite, right? We don't like the chaos that it introduces because of the potentiality that exists within a true infinity. We prefer x plus 1 because at least we've gotten comfortable with x.
That's it.
And we're comfortable with this formula
Yes.
that is, we're adding 1, right? So we understand both components.
Yes.
And even if we don't know what x plus 1 will result in truly, we can be assured of our gradual increase up and to the right. And I think that is really what we're getting at with these two systems, is the desire for certainty. Really, you talk about enclosurists. I think rightness is an aspect of this, but certainty is truly like that. Certainty is the root of all kinds of evils. And even that, I'm pulling that from the Bible. Money is the root of all kinds of evils, and money is a form of certainty. It's a game that we understand in our way of understanding things, but we don't have an understanding of the true infinity, and therefore we must participate in it in order to come to understand it, and we must relate to it in order to come to a greater and greater relationship, participation with it. And what I really wanted to say here is that the artist and their subjectivity, I think that's what I'm seeing as this bridge that and again, it's Petersonian. I'm just a big Peterson disciple, so it's like this is where my language comes from. But placing the responsibility on the individual is at least part of the problem. Like the institutions are failing largely because they don't have individuals responsible enough to run them in a virtuous way. An institution cannot be virtuous, right? It cannot be a virtuous institution apart from the virtuous people that make it happen and keep it running. And I'll stop there.
No, and excellent. And then the issue also is the higher the scale of the institution, the lower the probability that the people in it is virtuous to correct its lack of a tendency toward the virtuous, right? Like an institution is a tool. It's neither good nor bad. It depends on how it's using. But there is something about scale that increases the probability that it is used for bad. Why exactly that is, Friedrich Hayek has this lovely part, I think, in The Road to Serfdom, where he talks about why the worst get to the top. It gets into various dynamics that the top of an organization basically selects for sociopaths and psychopaths, but with that, we can get into that. And then there's also the wonderful Leopard Coe in his book, The Breakdown of Nations, that talks about this problem. It's the problem of scale.
Sorry,
Please.
just because I want to read that what was the first thing that you wrote?
Why the Worst Get to the Top by Friedrich Hayek. I adore Friedrich Hayek. I think he's really important. And the other one is Leopard Coe, who's a less known thinker, but he was friends with Ivan Illich, and his book, The Breakdown of Nations, is very good. And basically, the argument for Mr. Coe is that often we think the problem is left versus right. We on the right think the left is the problem, or we on the left think the right is the problem. And there's this idea that the problem is it's either left or right, or, conservative versus communism or whatever. The point he makes is that any system at large enough of a scale becomes problematic. Like capitalism on large enough of a scale is a problem. Communism on large enough of a scale is a problem. Conservatism on large enough of a scale is a problem. He said we focus way too much between the options and not the scale, when really there is a certain scale when all possible systems become tyrannical and problematic, right? Now, whether you buy that premise or not, I think he's offering a very important kind of wrinkle in the common political map. It's that we think too often between left and right and not enough between big and small, right? And there's also that book, Small is Beautiful, that talks about some of this kind of stuff. But then, of course, nevertheless, there seems to be a problem of scale that has to be considered. I like to talk about the difference between scale and spread, and a lot of what we're doing online, the social coordination mechanism, is an address of spread to deal with the pathologies of scale, because culture making is a matter of spread, not scale. It's grassroots, small people, bunch of people have YouTube channels doing conversations like this on the TLC, and that's actually how you make culture making. And then when you read book like Randall Collins or To Change the World, like spread absolutely changes culture. But one of the reasons it's hard for people to do is because they're tempted by scale, and they can't tell the difference between scale and spread. And spread is how you keep things human. And there's something about scale is that institutions naturally become, Luke likes to say demonic. Institutions, like they have this tendency toward the demonic because size does something to the subjectivity of the people in them. Does it have to? No, because I'm not a determinist, but probabilistically, it probably will. And then if the majority of things are that size, it's just a matter of probability that it's going to be problematic. One of the things I like to say, then I'll get to your question, is that, is it technically determined that people will become bad at scale? No, but it's practically determined that they will. And I think the practical is more real than the technical. We tend to associate the technical as being the truth and the practical is the false. Like what's technically true is true and what's practically true is not. No. It's the exact reverse. What's practically true is the true, and the technical is inconsequential because of personal knowledge, and we're persons, right? So the practical is more real than the technical, and that's very important. We emphasize the technical too much and don't emphasize the practical enough because that's the reality. Because we live in practice. We live as human beings. So the Leopard Coe stuff, Breakdown of Nations, is very, very important. And what I think also, like what you're saying with certainty, this is very, very important, is the brain naturally wants certainty because it doesn't want surprise. It wants to save energy, right? And if I'm certain, then I can save energy and I don't have to be afraid. Right? Like the opposite of faith is fear, actually, not doubt. It's fear. And so certainty is how I don't have to be afraid anymore because I'm certain, right? And C.S. Peirce basically says the brain's business is not to learn the truth, but to get certainty in his essay, The Ethics of Belief. The brain is more interested in certainty than truth because then I know everything and I'm safe, right? The problem that has happened in modernity is basically we think the choice is certainty or not knowing. Like we either have certainty or we don't know. That's what we think. Right? That's a false choice. When Leslie Newbegin says we need to think about proper confidence, and I like to talk about confidence. Confidence is where, I'm confident that a ball's going to drop when I drop the ball. I'm confident. I'm not certain, but I'm confident. And actually, all I need is confidence. I don't need certainty. Confidence becomes an operating principle, right? I don't need certainty to avoid nihilism. I just need confidence, right? And what's very interesting is that confidence is a virtue. Certainty is mechanical. Certainty is not a virtue. Certainty has a certain mechanical program to it. It's dehumanizing, right? So when you make the goal of thought certainty, you actually make it something that lacks virtue and thus personhood. And thus humans are replaceable by AI, of course. Because if the whole point of thought is certainty, and AI is seemingly capable of certainty, now I'd question that, but the idea is it's more certain. Well, then what role does humans have? Well, the point is not certainty. It's about confidence. And confidence is something, and to have confidence requires virtue. And confidence, like when you, and confidence is a relational logic, right? Like confidence is when you're not certain what your wife's going to say. You're not certain what's going to happen when you get together, but you're confident that something good will occur or something will surprise. That's enjoyable, right? You're confident, right? And so also too, what this all means is, well, there's a few things. Also to the only way to have a thing be definitive for a woman to become Michelle is confidence. Like you have to be able to say, I'm going to be able to handle the emotional life of this person. I'm going to be able to handle the insecurities I have in the presence of a full human being. Because that's the funny thing. When you're actually in front of a definitive person, it's like a Camus novel, The Fall, where you feel judged, you feel insecure, like you're hiding, you want to avoid vulnerability. You want to avoid vulnerability, right? Isn't that funny? Like avoiding vulnerability is tied to a lack of confidence, right? Because when you don't want to be vulnerable, it means that you want to be certain, right? To avoid being vulnerable. You don't want anything bad to happen. Whereas confidence is basically saying, if something bad happens, I'll be able to handle it, right? And so the last thing I'll say, because this is all tied to the true infinity question, we've made the goal of epistemology, like thought, certainty. And that sets us up for artificial intelligence and spurious infinities and stuff like that. Because the structure, like you said it very well. I know the structure of the spurious infinity, right? I know it's x plus, x plus. So I have that certainty. I don't necessarily know what will happen, but I have that certainty. Whereas when I say one, well, I don't know what's going to come out in one. I don't know how it's going to surprise me, right? So it's a surprise, right? So really what we need to do is make epistemology about confidence. And when I think about confidence, I think about like the hip hop artist, right? The cypher hip hop artist. Like a really good and Bernard and I would talk about this all the time. Like the hip hop artist who is really well trained in the cypher, they don't know what's going to happen in the cypher, but they're confident if they step into it, they'll be able to, make it happen, right? Like likewise, the jazz improvisationist is confident that they're going to be able to make it happen when they step onto the stage, right? Like they're going to be able to perform and it's going to go very, very well. Well, that is actually kind of what virtue is tied to creating, this kind of confidence that when I go into a situation, I'm going to be able to handle it. And please note, certainty means there's no limit. Confidence means there's a limit because you actually don't know. So confidence as an epistemology actually starts moving us in the direction of play because there's a limit. I don't know everything, but I'm confident I'm going to be able to handle it, right? So it's athletic. It's an athletic language, right? And it's what makes the hip hop artist or the cypher or the jazz improvisation so great because they don't know what's going to occur, and yet they're able to meet it, right? That is what thought is to be in service of, to lead into confidence. And the artist, when they go into the creative act, have a certain confidence of the ability to handle where the story's going. They believe that the ideas, they're going to be able to put it into words. They're going to be able to paint it. They learn in the creative act that although they don't know what's going to happen, they believe in their ability to be in the middle of that unfolding and realize it in the most fitting way, right? They don't have certainty, but they have confidence. And that is the mode of being that can start to bridge all of the theology and the society and the materialism and the idealism, because it is only in confidence that you can be a bridge between the two things. Certainty can't be a bridge because certainty is on one side of the shore or the other. If you want to bridge the dualisms, then you have to have confidence. Certainty, there's no bridging in certainty. And the artist, I think, trains you in confidence. And without that confidence, we're going to basically avoid other people. And this gets into the pluralism thing. The only way I can have certainty is to keep people who are different from me away. Like I have to avoid difference, right? Like difference is a threat to my certainty, right? But in confidence, bring all the difference you want. I'll be able to handle it. I'll be okay. Like confidence, you're not worried about pluralism. So it changes the frame entirely. But please.
I'm just thinking about one of the things I had written down in anticipation of our conversation is that there's like good and evil are opposed, truth and lie are opposed, and beauty, I was wondering, is beauty the only non-relative eternal virtue? But obviously, like ugliness is sort of opposed to beauty. The whatever there is an opposite there, and so that fell through, as I was thinking about my fun idea. But I was thinking about beauty as potentially non-relative because it's sort of um it just seems less subjective. But then I was thinking, beauty is in the eye of the beholder and all these things. So where I'm going now is with these virtues and their opposites. I think there's like Nietzsche critiques Christianity for sort of transvaluing these things. So it's like, uh, you know, God loves the sinner. So if you're bad or you're evil, that's okay, and then, you shouldn't prioritize beautiful people because that's being mean to other people created in God's image, even if they're ugly in whatever way. And then, I don't know what we do about lies. Lies is tricky, but whatever. Like, it doesn't matter if you're technically truthful because it's hard to be truthful all the time or whatever. And so there's this like blah of that Nietzsche's trying to critique in Christianity. And obviously, like, that's not a good thing and nobody would really stand for that. But what you end up with is sort of this enclosurist, like, true is important and good as we define it is important. And beauty is so subjective that I don't think very many enclosurists want to deal with it because it's so it's truly infinite maybe and extremely subjective. So I guess my thought is maybe when it comes to the virtues and God in this particular context of like, does God love evil people? Well, yes, I would say, and that's the true infinity of God. But no, he doesn't want them to continue to do evil or be evil, right? There's this call towards the virtuous that then truly aligns and incorporates the subject, like the subject that is evil, let's say. That's a bold claim, but the evil subject is then incorporated as they are drawn into this goodness. They're realigned or something like that.
No, it's an excellent question, and I would also argue that beauty, as Jochen and I will discuss, and Javier and different people, starts to deal with this problem of bridging the theology and metaphysics of Christianity and the creative act, which you asked about at the beginning, because they seem to be a kind of conflict with one another, right? And so the question is, how do those things kind of come together? Which becomes kind of a major tension in different things. And it gets, because one of the issues is that I think for a lot of people, the Christian who is creating things is distracting from God, right? Like if you create art, it's entertainment and they could be focusing on Jesus and instead they're focusing on you. And there's this concern about egotism and so on, right? And that has been notably pronounced in forms of Protestantism, early, apparently, and I don't know if this is true, but the early Karl Barth was basically only wanted to preach in a church that had no paintings, no art or anything, so that people focused on the Bible, that the image distracted from the word, so on and so forth, right? But this is all very problematic. So first off, there's something about how our understanding of beauty is tied. We actually confuse beauty with symmetry. Like these things look good together, right? And really what becomes very difficult is taste and pleasure, aesthetics, are actually not beauty. Like in the way that like a Plato or an Aristotle or different people would talk about beauty, right? That beauty is actually more like a mystical experience, honestly. Like it's more aligned with the mystical. And by calling beauty simply like a painting, like that's a pleasant painting, right? That we kind of get confused on what exactly beauty is. And as a result, it's hard to place it in relation to the true and the good, right? We say, and then you end up saying, oh, ugly people are not beautiful, and you're in this confused thing with subjectivity and stuff like that, right? One of the other reasons, and I mentioned this at Parallax, it's very hard for us to be struck by beauty anymore because we've also seen photographs of things before we experience it. And what I mean is we now go to the Grand Canyon having already seen photographs of the Grand Canyon. So it's hard for us to strike us. Now, paintings could absolutely lead to the strike of beauty, and I always like to emphasize the strike of beauty because it has this surprise, bam, it hits you out of nowhere. Like you come out of the forest and there's the Grand Canyon, and you don't even have the phrase Grand Canyon. There's just this in the fullness of its definitiveness, right? So likewise, if you had never seen Notre Dame, or never seen perhaps the Mona Lisa or Van Gogh, and you find Van Gogh, and there's no replication, there's only the painting of Van Gogh, then the experience of that art would be more likely to strike you. It would be more likely to hit you now, right? But now it's more difficult. So in a way, the more and more you get into replication, in industry and things like that, the relationship, in a weird way, the relationship between art and beauty is harder to have overlap. Often art and beauty are actually separate now, and that's a big problem. And actually a challenge for the artist today is to create in a manner that creates the strike in light of replication, in light of all of the content, to create this kind of original effect. And the strike of beauty. So the other thing too is beauty is not subjective, it's conditional. And I think conditionalism is between subjectivity and objectivity. Where what I mean by conditional is that I have in mind, and the example I always love is the rainbow from Owen Barfield, right? Like a rainbow is conditional. It has to be raining, there has to be sunlight, and you have to be standing in the right position. And if you meet those conditions, you will see the rainbow, right? Likewise, to have a shadow, there's conditions that have to be met. It has to be here, the sun has to be there, and then you'll have a shadow, right? Is that subjective? No, it's conditional. Anyone who is in those conditions will experience the shadow. Anyone in those conditions will experience the rainbow. It is not universal, meaning it is non-conditional, but if you meet the conditions, it occurs, right? So many things that we call subjective are actually conditional. And it just turns out that our personhood and how we formed it and the experiences we've had changes the conditions we meet and participate in, which changes what we can experience. But anyone who underwent those conditions would actually be able to have those experiences. And here's the kind of the key move of like Aristotle virtue ethics and all that. The claim is that virtue is to meet conditions that by meeting those conditions, you can now experience reality fuller. You actually colors are more like colors. People are more like people. That virtue is phenomenological. Virtue is not merely moral and ethical and something you do because you're a good person. That virtue actually opens your aperture of experience. That then as you experience life at this higher quality, you then only want that. So then you only want to be virtuous and you get a feedback loop, right? Like you wouldn't go back. It's like Lewis says, the problem with the sinner is they're too easily pleased, right? So in virtue, you actually get a higher quality pleasure that motivates you to be virtuous because now you want more. You want more of this higher experience, right? And that experience of higher quality is beauty. The beauty that then makes you want to be more virtuous, to make blue more like blue, creation more like creation, people more like people, that is the movement of beauty. The depth of the true infinity is the movement of beauty. Because it's beauty because you see it. You don't calculate it. You see it and here's the key, it attracts you. It attracts you into it, right? And in that very attraction, so here's the other move. There's a weird way in which the three infinities all are equal, but then also not at the same time. And what I mean by that is beauty is the highest, but in beauty, it's like concentric circles. So true is on the outside. Then you get good, and then you get beauty. If you get beauty, you get the other two. But if you only get good, you might get true, but not beauty. And if you get true, you don't get those two. And here's the key. If you don't move to beauty, it's as if you never had any of them. So there's a developmental logic here too. Like you start in the true. I say, this is a pen. Okay. Then I go, and it's good to use. What's good to use is to write. That's the telos. And then what's beautiful is to do poetry. Right? Let me put it that way. Okay? If you never use the pen to do poetry, you'll stop to even care that it's good when it writes, or that you won't care that this is a pen, right? So true. This is a pen. That's what this is. What's good is to write with it because pens were made to write, quote unquote. So it's good to use. That's the teleological conception of Aristotle. And then if I do poetry in a manner that breaks your heart, then that's beauty, right? If I never get to beauty, I could still use it in a good way. I could still know what the pen is, but I won't care. That's the weird move. The only way to care that you have the good and the true is in beauty. From the standpoint of beauty, then the good and the true are included as well as participating in the beautiful. But if you don't make it to the beautiful, it's as if you never made it anywhere at all. And that's the weird retrospective move here, where the co-equality of the good and the true and the beautiful must be from the standpoint of the beautiful, of which requires virtue to get into, and virtue of which gives you access to the beautiful is in the good and in the true, but they're all co-affording one another, but it has to be in that strike of beauty. And here's the move. When you have that experience, then people want to come to the church. Then people want to be like Christ because it makes blue more like blue, and it has an evangelical character to it in the beautiful, as opposed to telling people this is true, and if you don't believe it, you're in a lie. Well, I don't care because it's not beautiful. It's like, but it's good for you to be like Christ. I don't care because it's not beautiful. Once it's beautiful, they'll care, and you'll get that as well. You got to put first things first, so you don't even get second things, as Lewis said. So I'll pause.
You have this way of like ending with a crescendo, and I went off in thousands of different ideas there at the end. But the thing that I'm seeing is maybe to go back to my humanity as fractal deepening of Christ. The thing is, it's still within the boundedness of Christ because he exists at the top of the set as the ideal, and then also undergirds as the foundation. And so the descent of Christ into human form is this it's almost like the true, right? And I was seeing that as you were laying it out. So you have the true and then the good, which is teleological, and then you have the beautiful. And the beautiful is also true,
yes,
in a way.
Yes,
and so it sort of like loops back
that's
on
it.
itself.
Exactly.
Yeah, and so Christ descending into human form, or like as a becoming human, he then lives the truth. He claims, "I am the truth," because he is that human that is also connected all the way up the stack to God. And so the truest form is good and beautiful as well. And so you have sort of maybe the infinity there.
Yes.
But with that in mind, you went off towards like maybe some more formational questions, like as groups of people who use this model and have discovered God to be sort of reality, how is it that we incorporate one another in our individual uniqueness that is so inefficient and causes disruptions, relational conflicts and all these things? How do we how should we aim to incorporate the beautiful? And so I'll give a little context to people about eunoia and sort of lead you in that direction, because I want to talk about this idea of beautiful thinking, but you created a thing to focus on getting people to think beautifully, and not just philosophically, but to express themselves through various mediums and participate in life with one another beautifully. And one of the founding myths is that the church is not well suited or prepared or focused on the artist, the sexually broken, and the intellectual. And as someone who completes that Venn diagram in my own life, in my story, I found that to be incredibly loving on your part to identify people like me who, at times in my life, I have been sexually broken, and I think for the most part, God has healed that in me, and that's really good. And then the artistic and intellectual things are much more inherent, and so I take less responsibility for those things. I receive those things from God, and then it's much more difficult to deal with the awkwardness of interacting with some Christian institutions in ways that I feel are natural. My intellectual or artistic way is natural to me, and yet it seems to cause rifts that I'm not intending, But also, I don't just want to roll over and say, well, then I guess I won't be intellectual or artistic. And as long as I maintain your sexual ethic, I know I'm okay to participate. So, yeah.
No, outstanding. Well, usually those three overlap in people too, like because it's all tied to eros, which for the classical mind was the life energy basically of reality. And like for Dante, everything is erotic. Actually, it's not just sex, it's the very movement of the stars. And by losing sight of that, and also too, basically intellectualism, sex, and art are disordered without a conception of the beautiful. Like, because sex is toward the beautiful, right? Like, who cares for sex if it's just a pleasure? If it doesn't ultimately lead to beauty, then, I mean, we see people aren't having sex. Like, the numbers have dropped. It's one of the great ironies that the liberation of sex has been its demise. Because it turns out, without constraint, people don't care. And that becomes a kind of joke. Sex has become a spurious infinity. Likewise, what has happened with intellectualism, when you have, infinite interesting podcasts and in content like that, it can run the risk of being just a spurious infinity of, well, some people have called it, I think Limberg called it insight porn. So there's a problem of an insight porn if you're not careful, right? And then, of course, with creativity, we can get infinite creativity with AI, right? It can generate infinite MP3s and stuff, right? So all of these things are susceptible to true infinities. And basically, the person who has high eros in the direction is, if they don't find a community that makes them toward the beautiful, these three are almost destined to be disordered. And if the church can't think the beautiful or know what it is or cultivate spaces to direct it toward it, then those individuals will be in massive trouble. And high eros also correlates with culture making potential. And a church that lacks eros is going to end up in culture wars because it can't culture make. And then it won't be able to deal with the political, it won't be able to deal with the economic, and here we are. So those three are a very big deal. And I think Sartori was mentioning how often churches, notably Protestant churches, can have a whole lot of talent in their midst that they never actually select or realize because they're not looking for it or don't know they should look for it. Excuse me. They're looking for perhaps the extrovert or the person with more pastoral capacities. And I'm not saying extrovert is bad. Everything is good in different ways. You need all of the capacities. But if your selection mechanism or your discernment mechanism is lopsided, then you're going to get dysfunction. Right. So the eros is a really big deal. We would talk a whole lot. So let me say a few more things. Like on this idea of the good and the true. If this is beauty and you're attracted toward beauty, you know how everyone's like, it's groundless, nothing's true. You don't need a ground if beauty's attracting you. It's pulling you up. So it functions as the true. Because the true are the facts, right? And why do we emphasize facts? Because we have to have a common ground. If we don't have a common ground, we're all going to fall through, right? Well, actually, beauty keeps you from falling, right? Like it actually gives you something that pulls you together. And if everyone's totally...
You just made me believe in the rapture.
There is something, I tell you what, as long as it gets away from that disembodied stuff, there is something about rapture in beauty that is pulling everyone together, joy, rapture, and so on. But it's the rapture of Michelle, not disembodiedness or different things like that, right? And also, too, it should be noted, I believe that line in Thessalonians, and you go meet in the clouds. In that tradition, you meet someone outside the town and walk with them in, right? So you meet them in the clouds to walk them to creation, right? Like you go meet the guests. So anyway, but there is something rapturous there, right? But beauty, like what beauty does is it creates the ability of an orbit as well. Like you're commonly orbiting the beautiful. You don't have a solid ground, but actually who wants a ground? We want to soar, dang it. We want to fly. We want to do something elegant, right? So beauty gives you that. And it creates the effect of the gestalt, like all the birds moving together, right? Like, which is different from an aggregate. So beauty creates the possibility of a gestalt versus simply a controlled coordination of things together. But with the intellectual, so for us, like these three areas of the church, just in our experience, and I'm thinking with Evan Hansen and Wynne Collier, who wrote a wonderful biography on Eugene Peterson, met Eugene Peterson, really great. Nicole, Matthew, other Nicole, Bernard, a whole lot of people that were part of this. And it was a very important thing. And still there in Charlottesville doing extraordinary work. Latasha, I can go on. It's that thing where you're trying to name everyone you can't. But all these Matt and Rachel and Joanna and Grant and, Link Anderson, I can go on. But the point is, these three areas seem to be the areas where the church, it's that they kind of pretended like they would avoid it. Like there was a kind of avoiding of the topic. It wasn't that anyone came out straight up and said it's bad. They just, next Sunday we'll talk about it. Next Sunday we'll talk about it. Next time, next time, next time. And it just kind of keeps going, spurious, deferral, and then the surprise happens. Somebody in your midst is doing art, and because you're not prepared, the surprise breaks you. Or you get rid of them. When there's a surprise that draws that you're not ready for, it can break the church unless you make them the problem, right? So what ends up happening is you get all these individuals who weren't malicious. They were just trying to be true to what they thought God put on their heart, the Holy Spirit, that then brought a question mark, quote unquote, into the midst of the church, that then it didn't have the training in intellectualism or conversation or uncertainty to think. And therefore, and also it got into the problem of sola scriptura, because how do I fit things that are not explicitly discussed in the text? Does that mean it is bad? Right? Well, I don't want to think about all that because I'm already lacking time energy from my 9 to 5. I can't pay my bills, so it's much easier simply to remove the person or to basically say, can you wait a little bit? We'll get back around to that in a few weeks. It's usually not like a direct sort of pushing out. It's more of a, just wait. Yeah, that's cool. But then the person doesn't feel seen, and then they have to go home and decide it themselves. And ultimately, porn, addiction, that's what ends up happening almost every day of the week because you don't have an outlet for the arrows, right? And so it gets disordered because disorder is inevitable where there's not a community in which you can be integrated into. And so those things have to be integrated into as well, right? So, basically when we're around at that period of time, and I know that there's a lot more that can be said, but there's not really a robust theology of sex. I mean, John Paul II wrote Theology of the Body, which is still an underexplored text. I mean, you do now. Rob Bell wrote Sex God, but not back then. There's more people trying to explore it. But again, I still think because of a lack of beauty, there's a confusion about what exactly sex is and gender and all of those different things, because you get a conception of you're trying to define sex in terms of the good and the true when you really need the understanding of the beautiful. Sexuality is tied in the making a particular definitive, making a woman Michelle. And sexuality is the entire process of that ever deepening true infinity, right? Like you can't understand sex without true infinity. Like it's not going to make any sense. Likewise, you can't understand intellectualism without true infinity because there's not something you're in your learning being ever deepened into. And you're not going to understand creativity without true infinity because instead you're just a content producer stuck in a spurious infinity. And if you don't get a next novel out, your publisher is going to be mad at you. And now you're on the rat wheel and you're miserable. Yeah, you turn into a content creator and you're miserable. So ultimately, Eunoia, the unity between these focuses, and then any questions on any of that, is the concept of recovering the beautiful. Like the focus on the beautiful as not merely being aesthetic symmetry, but that Rilke strike, you must change your life, creating the condition. And ultimately, beauty is the experience of Gestalt, as James Wigley says. Like when you experience Gestalt and you feel caught in that experience of something moving through you in insight, and all of that has to be explained. That's ultimately beautiful. And it's the response. And then the goal of the church should be to create that experience. Like it should be to create that experience. Why and how exactly, those are things we have to get into, but I'll pause.
The true and the good seem almost like they map to the ratio that I was discussing earlier. And so if you think of it in thirds, which is imprecise, but 2/3 rational, 1/3 intellectus, which is it's the pure looking, just receiving what it is that's coming in. I'm thinking of like it's 2/3 rational, 1/3 intellectus, but that 1/3 is actually 100% of what's actually happening, and so it's a strange thing where you do need both or all three. And this isn't to say that things that are true and good are not valuable or virtuous, but just that they are inherently incomplete, like what you were saying. And yeah, I really appreciate the particularity of beauty, using the example of women becoming a woman, becoming Michelle. That idea is obviously relational. Yes. Like it's you can relate to women, but you can't really, not really. Like
exactly,
you sort of can say that that is a phenomena that occurs in your life, but then you you definitely can say, well, yes, there was this woman at the grocery store. I did relate with her, but there's no depth to that. And then when you have a wife or even just a good friend, like they become your friend with a name and a story, and you can place them within your story, and you kind of go back and forth, and that particularity is essential. And I guess I'm thinking of the way that we laid this out, like with the triad of eros. There, it's like the artist engages in creative work essentially. Sex, as properly ordered, is procreative, and intellectual endeavors are also procreative. And so these things naturally beget more things, and there is beauty in that way of being. I guess the procreative thread of beauty is fascinating to me, and I guess it ties back to this idea that, like, I try to push against 6-day creationism as the
Sure.
only biblical interpretation. That's really all I'm doing. I don't necessarily believe
Sure.
evolution is true, or even have confidence that it's true, to use your language. But I definitely don't have certainty about the one interpretation that most of the people I know that are Christian advocate. And that's not to just be difficult. It's because of some problems that I have with the way that plays out in the world. But what I'm seeing today is like the story that we miss when we reduce this to some sort of scientific, video camera footage of the origin of the universe. The story of a creator creating creators is so sad to me,
Right.
because in the version that I push back against, it's like God created you and then you sinned. It's like then we have a very internally consistent system that we can use to accomplish our goals, but it doesn't convey the significance of the individual, the particular, the subject that you are, with your own perspectives, but also with your own calling. And so I feel like this is how it relates to the meaning crisis and all of these things. Like you're absent of meaning in your life. This is why the virtues dissipate, and you have all this disorder in your life, because you're looking for an outlet. Like Nietzsche would say, I think that the eros is actually the way that you become virtuously aligned with the world. And we can argue about what Nietzsche's virtues are or how he orders them, but the process is true, that when you don't give an outlet here, and I feel like that's so relevant to the church, and this is something I talk a lot about, but I guess I'll throw it back to you with this. Like, you were mentioning Sartori's comment about the way that a lot of talent gets passed over within the church, but that's because it is a sorry, I'm forgetting our terminology here, but it is a spurious infinite game of plus one. And the one that you're adding needs to be a certain type. And so you avoid, because you're self selecting for a certain game, where in reality, when we all are called by beauty, we come together and we take various shapes and forms. And that's very chaotic and scary to lots of people, because it's not repetitive. But in its I don't know, in a more ideal form, I was going to use words that you shouldn't use, absolutes. In a more ideal form, the church calls people out into the freedom of their constrained subjectivity. We need you to be you and only you in Christ. Like, Christ in you is a relationship that only you can have. And so we require that for the full functioning of our particular group. So anyway, I just think that Eunoia as an artistic space offers much more of that, obviously, and I'm sure much less of other things that churches offer. But in doing so, you format a space in such a way that people are called into being themselves with the true, the good, and the beautiful. or God, and that is really exciting to me in a way that a lecture-based sort of worship service is, well, you're not good enough to be on the worship team, and well, you're not clear enough of a public speaker to say what you're thinking in church, and these things are just, no one would ever say that. But of course, you can't lead the men's group because you talk too much or whatever it is. Like, it's just, that's not efficient. That's not aligned with our goals.
Oh, well, that was excellent. Well, without a conception of the beautiful, then judgments of excellence are just opinions of the good, and it's a personal attack, as opposed to, no, you can't be on the worship team because we are trying to create a gestalt with everyone here that actually points them toward the beautiful, right? So it's about the gestalt, right, that you're a part of. So, without the beautiful, like, there's a weird way in which without the beautiful, you can't deal with the inevitability of judgment, but in a manner that feels arbitrary and hurtful, and it leads to all sorts of problems, right? But the artist is constantly judging what works in their story and not, and they're cutting things out, and it's nothing personal. It's necessary for the construction of the effect of the work, right? So a lack of the phenomenology of the artist also leads to these, political group dynamic problems and so on, right? It should just be noted as well that in Plato's tripartite soul, it's the eros, themos, and logos. You have to have all three or the soul is disordered. Typically, churches can be pretty good. The society's pretty good at logos, at learning and ideas like that. I would argue it's thematically deficient. That's why you have a crisis in masculinity. People can't, you're not getting the man, the chest, as Lewis says. Like, themos is the battlefield, but it's also it's glory. It's the ability of participating in something hard, so you need the thematic to be addressed. And then, of course, the erotic, like, there's a form of the disordered eros. Like, look at it this way. There's a weird way in which eros is everywhere in our society, but also nowhere in our society, right? There's a weird way where our society is logos without thymos, so the eros becomes dopamine, not art. Like, it's not creative, right? The themos plus the eros makes creativity, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in. This podcast is sort of like a journal or something. Like, I try to say my thoughts so I can reference back to them later. But I was thinking about the specialization of people in our society leads to the disablement that I've heard you talk about. Is that Hume or Illich?
Illich.
Illich talks about disablement, where you just don't have any ability to do anything. You use the example of contractors, so that's a job. Somebody becomes a contractor, they can then build houses, and that's okay. But if you learn enough on your own to just kind of dabble and build your own house because it's for you, and who cares? Well, that's actually dangerous and scary, and what's the word? Inappropriate or perverse. It's perverse. And I was thinking of what you were just saying, and maybe even from the concept of Hickemorianism or something like that, where people aren't having sex. We were talking about that. Part of the reason is because pornography is proliferate in our culture, and so it's less about all of these options of real people in real life. Those options are still technically available. It's not like people have spread out or something, but it's more about the ease with which they can fulfill their desire. And so then it's ironic because then you have a small set of people that are recording videos of doing something that everyone wants to do, but no one does because those people do it. And it's this strange thing that I think I'm trying to use something that's a little distasteful, because that's disablement, right? And we're all becoming disabled, and the same applies for all these different siloed, certified sort of fields that people operate within.
Well, to say something very large, one could say the ultimate demonic conspiracy, because I know Willard has the whole divine conspiracy, but the ultimate demonic conspiracy is a disablement of the ability to experience beauty. If we become disabled to experience beauty, we lose. To say something like it's game over, because then you can't get a gestalt. Like, you can only get an aggregate. You can only get fragments that can never they can never harmonize. Therefore, violence is inevitable. And our very here's the thing: without beauty, our very notions of the good and the true end up in war. Like good and true without beauty ends up in relativism, separation, my idea of the good, and we fight and we conflict, and the social order dissolves. And ultimately, without beauty, our ideas of the good and the true become sources of anxiety that we then want to have AI offload from us, so we give over our humanity to the machine, precisely because we don't want to be tortured by our ideas of the good and the true. So without beauty, it's kind of like game over in some respects. And that's a large thing. I have to go into that. And I think our moment in history is basically where the plausible deniability has run out that is the case. And we were talking a bit with that last night with Seth and Aspasia. Basically, what ends up happening is, like sex, you only care about sex if it is in service of the beautiful. And if ultimately it's just an orgasm, it becomes spurious and you don't care. And ultimately, here's the other thing, like the pornography creates the ultimate entrapment because you get habituated to only ever experiencing sex as basically a means to an end of an orgasm. And so you're entrapped in that notion, and there's no idea of actually, no, the erotic sex can be Beatrice that is toward the beatific vision, and it's always pulling you into a greater and greater and greater depth, right? And that also is how you deal with the problem of the ugly, because actually when you get the definitive, you find that the ugly is experienced with the strike of beautiful, actually, because of the very definitiveness, because when your wife is 70 years old, you remember all the things you went through together, the thymotic overcoming, the things that they became, the conversations you had, and so the strike of beauty is still there. But you can't just say, here's the key, the problem of ugliness is that I can't just say that's beautiful if it's ugly, because I'm lying, right? I can't just say it. I have to earn it. You have to earn beauty in the quote-unquote ugly, or the aging, or the decrepit in the old. And the only way you do that is a personal relationship that you make yourself vulnerable to, and sex becomes a testament to that. And if sex is not that, it's spurious and whatever. And it just kind of dies out, right? So sex is doomed without beauty because it's not in service of the definitive. Creativity is doomed without beauty because then it's just content created that leads to burnout. Look at all these people on YouTube that are kind of tortured and they want to cancel and they're overwhelmed and they have burnout and different things. So creativity is dead. And then intellectualism is over because it's all just interesting. Like the great tyranny of intellectualism is, oh, that's interesting. Oh, neat. I know more trivia facts, right? And that's death. So without the beautiful, all of these key characteristics become fragments that at best we can shore against ruin, not that that makes a difference for the ruin, and then we say something about peace that passes understanding at the end of Eliot because it's beyond us. So basically the demonic conspiracy is it is to disable us from meeting the conditions necessary for the strike of beauty. And basically when we lose that, then we don't get the strike of beauty, and thus you don't create a gestalt, and thus you don't create Holy Spirit, because Holy Spirit is gestalt. Like there's this tension, like, okay, like with church. Is church where two or more are gathered, or is it a building, right? Now, there's a danger for Christians to demonize buildings, because buildings matter. They form us, so buildings matter. But then there's also this weird thing in Christianity where seemingly the church isn't just that. It's more of the Holy Spirit and all of that. How do you make sense of that? It's because it's a gestalt. Like, it's that what happens is the church is where I move and it affects you. You play the piano. I'm in the jazz improvisation. We talked about it with Seth and Aspasia. A gestalt is not merely a collection. It's a co-interrelating movement, right? It's just like, gestalt is when you're in your kitchen and you're thinking about what you said to your friend the other day and you're wondering about them. That's weird. Why are you in your kitchen thinking about your friend the other day? Because you're in a gestalt with them. Because like what they do affects you, and it's now affecting how you're in the kitchen, and there's a relation and a co-mutual action. And now that you've thought about them, that's a cause and effect, like a billiard ball hitting another billiard ball, and you may call them, right? So there's cause and effect across space and time. That's not bound by space and time. Interesting. But it's bound by the person. So that's the issue. Like a true infinity is bound by personhood, not by space and time, and it becomes a moving gestalt. That is what the church is, and the argument of Christianity is you're not going to care very much about the building if you don't also have that gestalt, right? So if the church were to get back in the business of helping people meet the conditions of possibility for experiences of the beautiful that would make a gestalt out of them, then people would care about the church. If it doesn't do that, then they're not going to care about the building, because we don't care about the pen that doesn't become beautiful to us. We don't care about anything that ultimately doesn't form a gestalt. And that's where we find meaning in other things, and that's ultimately where we find freedom. Now, what the conditions are and more of the virtue and humility and all these other stuff kind of opens the field, but we need to see virtue as connected to meeting the conditions necessary for the experience of beauty that then opens the possibility of Gestalt that creates Holy Spirit, where then you think about the person even when you're in the kitchen and they have an influence on you and you have an influence on them. And there's a music that a jazz improvisation that spreads between you and many people that is not bound by space and time because it is bound by the person, and that creates a true infinity versus something spurious.
Yeah, and the artist is one. Well, I wanted to say it this way, actually, that we all can be artists.
Yes.
We can all be creative and participate in the world in that way. And yeah, I can't remember where it was in our conversation, but I just want to sort of slap this on as like an appendix to our conversation that there was at one point where it just all clicked for me that everything that we talked about, that's kind of a lot to condense down into the last year, but everything we talked about is why God is a subject, right? He is someone in the strange and infinite way that he is. And I think that our inability to grasp our own selfhood or some oneness is, and I'll just speak for myself, actually, my inability to grasp that is tied to my inability to sort of relate to God as a person, because obviously he is not a man per se, although he has given us Christ as a representation, and maybe this is why that's so inherently essential to relate to him through Christ. But the God that is the Father and creator of all of these things that's so massive and terrifying and beautiful is also a subject that interacts in all of the ways that we just detailed that we interact, and has the constraints that we just detailed as well. And I think his constraints are good, true, and beautiful. And maybe that's why we keep bumping up against those virtues, because they are the bounds of this infinite one that we relate to.
Well, what I would say, so there's a few things. First off, you were mentioning the 6-day evolutionary thing. One of the things we have to keep in mind is that if God would have theoretically given us an entire theory of the cosmos in the Bible, the book would be 100 million pages long. Second, the Bible would not be with us because no one would have understood it. Like, that's the other thing. It literally wouldn't have made it to us, right? Because it'd be incomprehensible. And third, it would have removed a bit of free will, because it kind of would have been obvious God wrote this book then at this, or had some sort of spirit, right? So there's a certain sort of notion that there's no justification for why Genesis would not be a literal version of the cosmos, but actually there would be many justified reasons. It wouldn't have made any sense to anyone. There's no possibility of Genesis including every detail of every process that brings about the universe in the way that it is. And if you did it in Genesis, why wouldn't you do it in Kings or other part of the books? And, you would have gotten a work that would have been, you would have gotten a map that equaled the territory and therefore been useless. Right? So that should be kept in mind. Also, too, it is clear now in evolutionary theory that there seems to be some mechanism of selecting form. It's not gradual, development. It's explosions of development at different periods. So the theory has to be rethought in different ways. But there is a major problem that has happened with Christians that have basically been led to believe that it's a choice between religion and science, and this has been a problem that has led to pathologies and issues that were not necessary, that were not, I don't think the pathologies that various Christians have been submitted to were not necessary. Now, nevertheless, God can use them to create virtue. And funny enough, the very tension between those can actually be very generative of really great theology and thought, precisely because you have to think those things together. So I don't want to say that the error was not generative, but I do think we're entering a period where perhaps the error, the amount of generative creativity from that error is perhaps exhausted at this point. More needs to be said on that. Second, it should also be noted that, before I forget, that beauty entails limit, because we've been saying that limit creates a true infinity, where beauty, you're not, it limits you, because also when you experience the beautiful, you have to focus on that. You don't feel like you can focus on anything else because the mystical experience grabs you. It limits your options, and yet also you're glad it limits your options, right? And also, once you taste the beautiful, You're just not satisfied in the same way by everything else, right? So it limits you, but you're glad it limits you, right? So that's a key characteristic of the beauty. It has a limiting that is a revelation that those limits are for you. And this is a key move in Hegel. And actually, you could argue much of philosophy is simply the debate of the role of limits. Now, that's a giant claim. But Hegel basically wants us to realize that limitation is for us. It is what actually makes us us. And it's what actually saves us from being overwhelmed by freedom. But also, limits actually unfold in human subjectivity in a way to stop tyranny, not create tyranny. But that only makes sense in the experience of beauty. Because in beauty, there's a limitation you're glad of, because that limit means that there's always something to unfold more of. Like Flannery O'Connor said, a mystery is something that as you learn about, you find there's more to learn about. So the limit moves. Here's the key. You're always limited, but that limit moves. So although there's always a limit, it always unfolds more and more. And so that limit is actually keeping you from being overwhelmed. That's the key. The limit is there to keep you from being overwhelmed so that you get into a position to handle more in the future, and more and more and more and more. So the limit is for you. It's a grace. But here's the key. It is only in beauty that limit has this characteristic. And then beauty gives this characteristic to the limits of good and true, but it has to be in the beautiful. I think also the relation between those three I wanted to note becomes easier to think when you see it as a movement. Like all of them are moving together, right? When we say, oh, does the true include the good and the beautiful? Well, it's all a motion. And the key is that it moves to the beautiful, but that motion is of the true and the good in the motion of the beautiful. So as a motion, there's a co-equality, but that motion is ultimately defined by an experience of the beautiful, which is also an experience of play and friendship and health, as Jochen will emphasize, right? So those things go together in important ways. And I think I'm so sorry. I will have work obligations, and it's my fault, and I'm so sorry because there's a lot more to be said. But beauty, basically, too, as the church emphasizes this space of creating beauty, then what you do is, yes, there's a certain playfulness to church that ultimately comes out. And I would say play is a place where logos, themos, and eros go together, because you have to be smart to learn how to play. But even if you're smart and strategic, if you don't have thymos on the soccer field, you're not going to make the goals. It's not going to be very fun. And then the only way you're ever going to be excellent at soccer is if you have eros desire to be excellent at soccer. And also if there's a certain beauty that you have to it. Same goes with, I wrestled for many years. You know, it's the same sort of logic to it as right. And so that truth of play as bringing those things all together, then we just need to carry to all the different areas of our life as well. But the only way to continually apprehend the limit is in virtue, and that is the limit of beauty of what can be afforded in all phenomena. And basically, I guess what I want to say on your last point there is that in a weird way, when God becomes Jesus as a definitive person, he's more mysterious. You know, we kind of tend to think that if God becomes a person, now he's oh no, we know everything about him. No, it's the exact opposite. When God's a generality and he's abstract, then he's women, and we can get perfect metaphysical knowledge about him or whatever. But when he becomes a person, he actually is more of a mystery, which means he invites more of a romance. He invites more of a relationship. And you see, so also too, there's something about the Christian story that basically suggests that God becomes definitive because reality is definitive. Right? Like if God didn't become definitive, then why would you ever think that the definitive is where reality is found? Maybe it would be found in women versus Michelle, right? But when God becomes Jesus, that is a testament to the reality that the fullness of being is found in the definitive, in a particular person, in a particular place, at a particular time. That we then have to, interesting enough, relate to through literature. Because literature versus a list of facts, you know, literature is how a personhood is carried through time. And literature also has to be interpreted, but guess who also has to be interpreted? Persons. Interpretation is not what keeps you from the truth. It is the way of knowing that is personal and definitive and mysterious. And interpretation is limited knowledge. Therefore, it can be a true infinity. And the very limit actually invites you more and more. And then the last thing I guess I'll say is that if something about being Christian is being like Jesus, then the likeness is a limit. It's an analogical reasoning is a limit. Because you can't equal Jesus, but you can't be like him. And likeness is a true infinity, and all thinking is ultimately analogical. Now, that was a giant claim, but it's actually all thinking is analogical because all thinking is actually always already participating in the truth that meaning comes from the definitive. And Jesus, as that which we're supposed to be like, means we simply align our personal lives in the way the thought actually operates, which is in the way that Eros actually cares the desire. And all of that actually creates courage and confidence in Thermos because you don't have the certainty to know where those things will lead. And yet, nevertheless, you desire to go to that place where you don't know it's going to be because you believe it's going to be beautiful because it has been and always will be because all things are new.
You, sir, are beautiful.
You are
That
kind.
was
Ian.
excellent. And I really appreciate your time today. I will link below ogrose.com and I'll give you the chance to collaborate and throw your channel on here. So that way people can get to know more of you and all that you do. It's a lot. It's a lot of stuff. I've watched a lot and I've read a lot and I feel like just a drop in the bucket. So I look forward to continuing to get to know you particularly.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Ian. I've enjoyed every minute of it. It's been a treat. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.